I think it's one of the greatest titles. I mean, we've had every title you can imagine in this Trump era, but I think that yours really hits it. We love our country, but we love two separate countries right now, it feels like.
That's right, yeah. And, I've been thinking about this since he declared he was running for president. He's occupied way more of my mind than I ever would have anticipated or than I'm certainly happy about. But, I think he's just of such historic importance. And I've been thinking hard about what could possibly explain this. And there have been so many explanations, and I've subscribed to most of them along the way. It's just racism, it's the economy, it's tribalism, it's Hillary's campaign, it's the James Comey letter, it's Russia. There's so many different explanations. It's the role of social media, it's the media bubbles that have been formed, especially on the right. But I think that really the largest overarching cause, and this is what the book is about, is that actually America was never really united in the first place, and that the founders didn't realize it, but in creating a new country based on Enlightenment reason, which is what they did, the Enlightenment was changing the world back in the 18th century. They were all men of the Enlightenment, and they wanted to build a new country based on the principles of reason. And they didn't fully appreciate how resistant much of the population would be to that idea. And so there was a Counter-Enlightenment which resisted the whole idea of running a world on reason and instead wanted to preserve faith and other aspects, not just religious faith, but intuition and subjectivity and national identity. And all of these things resisted the Enlightenment move towards reason and institutions and the rule of law and the social contract. And the thing is that because the Enlightenment triumphed and the United States has been such a huge success and science and reason dominate our lives now, we tend to assume that the Enlightenment just won. But actually the Counter-Enlightenment, as I show in the book, never surrendered, and there have been people who subscribe to that worldview throughout our history, demanding to be heard, and they are there to this day. And I think that Trump represents a historical crisis where that has come to the boil. And we are seeing essentially in Trump an uprising of people who live in a different worldview. They have a different view of truth itself. So that when we see these arguments between Trump supporters and Trump opponents, and Trump opponents will often say, "Are you trying to drive me crazy by saying these things that make no sense to me? Are you deliberately gaslighting me?" And on the other side, the Trump supporters think that Trump opponents are anti-American. And I think it's because they are literally living within two different worldviews. They see truth differently. They have very different values. In effect, they are patriotic to two different versions of America, and that's been true all the way along.
Man, I love that. Love the whole concept, and I got a lot to ask about you, but I hope some people call 831-900-5773, 831-900-5773. This is your chance to talk to somebody about the history and current state of an enlightened nation. So, Spencer, when we go back to the Founding Fathers, what were the two sides? Who were the people that really didn't want to go the way that Jefferson and Adams and some of these people were going?
It's surprising how deep these roots are, and actually I trace them back basically to ancient Greece. And in Western civilization, there's always been a tension between what's sometimes summarized as Athens versus Jerusalem. Athens representing Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and the tradition of reason, and Jerusalem representing the tradition of faith, whether you define that as Christian faith or Jewish faith or other faiths. So it's always been there. During the Age of Reason, which preceded the Enlightenment, first you had tremendous progress in science during what became called the Age of Reason with people like Copernicus and Galileo and Newton. And then you had the Enlightenment, which became more of a social and political and philosophical movement led by Voltaire and featuring Montesquieu and Rousseau and the other largely French Enlightenment thinkers. There was a Counter-Enlightenment, and I think traditionally, I certainly used to think of it this way. People assumed that anybody who resisted the Enlightenment triumph of reason was just trying to protect their own interests because maybe they were a bishop in the church and they saw their interests being threatened, or maybe they were a monarch or the aristocracy, and they saw that if we had democracy and social contracts, then their power would be threatened. Or maybe they were just uneducated and superstitious, and so they clung to old-fashioned superstitious ways of thinking and old-fashioned traditions and were afraid of change. And I think that's typical even to this day of the way Enlightenment thinkers tend to think of the Counter-Enlightenment. But actually, there were very well-educated, very intelligent philosophers, not just theologians, but philosophers as well, and artists, who understood the Enlightenment perfectly well, understood the value of reason, and still rejected it because they felt that, yes, of course, reason is necessary in order to solve problems that can be solved by facts and logic, but to shrink the world down to only that which can be discussed using the tools of reason is to shrink the world and to filter out much or most of what makes life worth living, which might be religious faith, but it might also be art. They felt tradition was crucially important. They felt it was a fantasy to think that there could be a universal culture with universal principles, but instead national identity was important. There was something distinctively German. There was something distinctively French, distinctively Italian. So that was really where they were coming from. And in fact, their influence is felt to this day, often even within the minds of people who think of themselves as creatures of the Enlightenment. For example, anytime anybody is talking about mystery or fantasy or trusting your instincts, anybody who's a fan of Tolkien or Star Trek or who likes to go to pop music concerts and get lost in the ecstasy of the crowd, anybody who reveres traditional cultures like Native American cultures or the traditional cultures around the world, these are all counter-Enlightenment tendencies. And so they're very much alive, I would say, in everybody to one degree or another. But what's happened in the United States is that as the Enlightenment became more and more dominant and the country became more science-driven and more technocratic and bureaucratic, and all of the sort of mystery and faith in life tended to get deprecated, pushed to the side, people who located themselves primarily within that worldview felt more and more excluded and more alienated from mainstream life. It's very hard to separate out from all of this just plain bigotry and ignorance and hatred. So that's why it's often missed, I think, because, for example, people who want to preserve their ethnic traditions very often just look like bigots or racists. And as soon as that's the charge that's made, the conversation is over. But that's why I say racism is definitely a part of the explanation of what's been happening under Trump. Some of the people who support him are just racists, but it's not the whole explanation. And I think we need to understand that bigger picture of these two worldviews, as I say, the counter-Enlightenment versus Enlightenment worldview.
Man, I love that. Yeah. You hit so many points with that, including here in Santa Cruz, where we got people who worship crystals, right? And they're on the far end of that thing. And then, you have people who say, believe in the Latin Mass and think anything less than that is sacrilegious. So you have
Both
all
of those
extremes.
are counter-Enlightenment positions, even though those people are usually very different from each other.
Right. It's interesting. Yeah.
And
then the subtitle, oops, go ahead.
No, sorry, you go ahead.
Subtitle of the talk is "What Would Lincoln Do?" And
that's for the event.
That's what I mean.
May 26th event, Saving Democracy. And just to be clear, there's the book, and then there's the event, and they're only tangentially related.
All right, but keep plugging. You need to plug these things. But I keep asking myself.
They're fairly closely related in that they're basically about the crisis in our democracy. It's just that one of them is my book, and the other one is an event that I'm moderating.
Well, I sure want to read your book. It sounds terrific. Normally, I would have read it, but anyway, before I talk
to you.
But
I will, and it's available on Amazon.com, and I hope we'll be able to make it available in more bookstores as well, especially local bookstores. But it's easy to find right now at Amazon.com.
Okay.
If you just search for Patriots of Two Nations, it'll come up.
So when we talk about Lincoln, this is something somebody else had told me once, and it was like a revelation to me. Lincoln never should have reunited the country. That's a theory that some have, that the nations were just too different. You have the slaveholders and the white supremacists. Maybe they should have been their own country and let the other people, and then trying to incorporate the Deep South and the North has never worked. And
right.
What do you think of that?
Well, that's an example of the two nations at war, and the worst example of the conflict I'm talking about, with more than 600,000 people dying. And in effect, that was the two nations actually fighting it out. Now, first, the number one cause of that war, of course, is racism. It was slavery. And any claim that it wasn't about slavery is just historically wrong. But it was also a classic conflict between the Counter-Enlightenment and the Enlightenment, which is characterized by tradition. The Counter-Enlightenment is characterized by tradition. So if you think of the South and the mythology of the South, it's very much about tradition. It's about aristocracy and heredity instead of, a flat hierarchy with pure democracy. So the South was trying to preserve aristocracy and tradition. The Counter-Enlightenment was about being tied to the land. There was this belief that the character of the people was very much tied up with the land. In its worst case, this becomes blood and soil nationalism as expressed by the Nazis. But there are more benign forms of it. For example, the English Romantic poets and the German Romantic movement was the same idea. Coleridge and Blake and these folks were Counter-Enlightenment figures who were arguing for the rural life where you're tied to the land and you're integrated with nature. That was part of the Southern mythology as well. Jefferson was, in some ways, a Counter-Enlightenment figure with his being bound to the land and the rural lifestyle, even while he was very much an Enlightenment political thinker. So that was what was going on there. Those were the two nations that were very much at odds and saw everything that matters about life very differently. Racism and slavery was by far the number one issue there, and the economics, just the cruel, brutal economics of slavery was 90% of the issue. But it was also the clash between these two worldviews. And as I say, at its worst, you get the Confederacy and slavery, or the Nazis. That's the most extreme expression of the Counter-Enlightenment. But there's a whole spectrum of expressions of it that includes very benign figures like William Blake, the Romantic poets, the great German poet Goethe. Hegel had Counter-Enlightenment aspects. Kierkegaard was a Counter-Enlightenment philosopher in many ways. And so there's this, and as I say, people who we think of as many of our friends who are into New Age religion or various forms of tribalism, whether it's tattoos or piercings, or the Grateful Dead, or all of these things are Counter-Enlightenment tendencies as well.
Hey, I got to do business here, our important public service business. You're listening to KSQD Santa Cruz. This is Talk of the Bay. I'm your host, Brad Kava. My guest is Spencer Critchley, the author of Patriots of Two Nations. A really, really great sounding book, deep into history and into the modern age, how we got President Donald Trump. We're going to take a break for some important words. We'll be right back in the blink of an eye.
Is your business or nonprofit offering special services during these trying times? Consider partnering with KSQD as an underwriter. It's an easy and inexpensive way to get the word out to the greater Santa Cruz community. Contact us via email at underwriting@ksqd.org. That's underwriting@ksqd.org. We're community radio, no squidding around, K-Squid, 90.7 FM, your ink spot on the dial.
And it is 90.7 FM, K-Squid, KSQD Santa Cruz, and you're listening to Talk of the Bay. Brad, back to you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much. This station is run by volunteers, Spencer. You know that. And people like Dan come in, so many of them bicycle. I respect that. He rides his bike. They come in and they they work for the public just out of pure love of serving and radio and trying to be a vital local community interest network, and it's something we miss in a lot of the country these days.
Yeah, no, it's a great thing, and as you know, I used to work at KUSP back in the day as the news director. I've got a very, very soft spot in my heart for public radio.
And it's they had a pledge drive over the last couple of weeks. They raised $20,000. I'm so happy
that's
about
great.
that.
That's terrific.
It really shows people care. Yeah. And anybody is still free to donate at 831-900-5773. They'll take them and send you a shirt and all kinds of things and help keep this thing on the air, because everybody works here for free, and they just pay the money to keep the generators on and pay the rent and keep the transmitter going. All right.
It's a great thing.
Yeah. So how long did it take you to write the book?
It's interesting. It just kind of poured out of me in a couple of months. I've been thinking I really should write a book for a while, for a number of years. And it's funny, I think anybody who's tried to write a book has had this experience of thinking, where am I going to find the time? If you have any other kind of job to do, and you get this advice about set aside an hour every morning and just do it. And it always seemed like there was something getting in the way. And then as these ideas gelled in my head, it wasn't like a problem finding time to write the book. I didn't want to do anything else. So I was putting hours into it 7 days a week, and I was enjoying it so much. It was just a really satisfying experience. So I probably spent a month or a little more writing it, and then the next month or so editing it. And there's a great saying, it's okay to write badly as long as you edit brilliantly. And I think that editing is such an important part of writing. You've got to plan to just go through it again and again and again. Even if you think you got it pretty much right the first time through it, you're going to be surprised with all the editing you want to do. Oh, right.
They all say there's no such thing as writing. It's all rewriting.
It's all rewriting. And that's really, I think, it's crucially important. There's a myth that when I say it poured out of me, it doesn't mean it was easy. And I think there's a myth about any kind of creative work that it should come easily. And I don't think there are any people who do good work or aspire to doing good work who would tell you that it was easy. It's always that trying to get it right process that takes the time.
So
Brad, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, it's too much. Go ahead.
There's too much to talk about in half an hour.
I know. That's what I was going to say. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, there was something I wanted to mention because I was talking about the worst of the Counter-Enlightenment culminating in Nazism, and one of the things that comes up in the book is that this polarity between the sort of faith-driven, intuition-driven, tradition-driven, kind of ethnic culture-driven side, which is the Counter-Enlightenment, versus science and reason and logic and the rule of law and institutions and bureaucracy and the social contract, which is the Enlightenment tradition, both have their extreme versions. And so the extreme version of the Counter-Enlightenment at its worst is Nazism. And there's an extreme version of the Enlightenment tendency, which is communist dictatorship. So Lenin and Stalinist Lenin, Marxist-Leninism was awful. I mean, the Soviet Union was responsible for more deaths even than the Nazis. And that is the extreme version of rationality. And Nazism is the extreme version of Romanticism, essentially, the romantic ethnic tradition coming out of Goethe and Wagner in the case of the Nazis. Whereas communism, Marx was influenced very much by what he thought was a scientific understanding of history, which turned out to exclude everything that was human or tender and forced humanity to fit into a scientific system instead of accommodating itself to humanity, and killed people if they wouldn't fit with the theory. And I think that split exists also in each of our own heads. We all, to some degree or another, think intuitively and creatively and artistically and synthetically, and also we think in terms of narratives and facts and logic and making sense of things. So in a sense, these horrible clashes we've seen, like with the Nazis versus civilization, or the awful things that happened under the Soviet Union or under Mao in China or in Cambodia under Pol Pot, these things are ultimately happening within our own heads. And in order to reconcile the two sides that we see at odds with each other, at odds hardly states it, nearly at war in some cases with each other in modern-day America, I think ultimately involves reconciling the split within our own heads and learning how to speak across the gap. And that requires, and I make this argument in the book, for people on our side of it, which I would identify not just as political liberals, but classical liberals, lowercase liberals, meaning essentially descendants of the Enlightenment. So this includes moderate conservatives and anybody who believes in democracy and the rule of law and reason. We need to learn to speak a new way that's not so reason-driven. We shouldn't surrender our commitment to reason, but in order to communicate with people on the other side of this gulf, we're going to need to learn to speak more in terms of symbols and emotion, which, by the way, is the way Trump speaks. He doesn't need to make sense. He's trafficking in symbols and emotions, not in a condescending way, but in a sincere way, in order to make a connection and build trust before trying to win any arguments, because that's not going to work to continue to try to speak in an Enlightenment language to people who are on the other side of this gulf. Now, I would hope that people on the other side would make the same effort, but somebody's got to start. And as somebody who lives mostly on the Enlightenment side of this, I figure, why not us?
Isn't capitalism supposed to be the bridge? Wasn't that the promise, that it would make both of those things irrelevant in a way and link them both? Didn't Marx
it's interesting
say
because that's an Enlightenment solution. I would argue that you have this rational system. You know, there's an old saying that countries that have McDonald's restaurants don't go to war with each other, I think is one way of expressing that. That turns out, I don't think, not to be strictly true. It's in nobody's rational self-interest to go to war or to hate each other or to be bigoted or intolerant. And I think many of us, I used to think this way, that the sheer rationality of the case was leading towards what Francis Fukuyama called the end of history when he wrote that book in 1992, that through liberal democratic capitalism, we had arrived at not a perfect system, but the best system in history, and history was essentially over, because it was basically in everybody's interest to cooperate and be peaceful and tolerate diversity, and everybody would get rich, and gradually the average income would increase, and technology would get cleaner, and it looked that way in the 90s. There was a moment there when many people on the left, moderate right, thought that history was converging on a solution, and things would only get better. And it's amazing. We lived that way sort of during the Clinton administration for a few years, and then it all fell apart. And now we're dealing with the opposite of that, with this enormous uprising of tribalism and ethnic nationalism and outright racism and hatred, as if it's a reaction to the near end of history. And so I don't think that an Enlightenment-only solution of just being reasonable is going to get us there. And I don't think continuing to argue with people on the other side just using facts and logic is going to work. We're going to have to find other ways to speak, which, coming from our direction, from the Enlightenment towards the Counter-Enlightenment, is going to require learning to expand our way of thinking and speaking so that it incorporates more symbolism, emotion, and intuition, which, as it happens, is something that people who live in the rational world are constantly pursuing anyway, with all of these pursuits I was mentioning, with interests in art and spirituality, and even just how much we love cultures like Hawaii or Italy, or any culture that seems more in contact with the soul, is a manifestation of this. So I think we're going to have to do more of that kind of reaching out, even within our own country, in order to just connect and build trust before we have any hope of engaging on an argument in any fruitful way.
You know what was absolutely amazing during those years, and still going on up until recently? The only way to get into space for a long time for us was to hitch a ride on a Russian rocket. So we were in this international space station, which truly was international, with Russians, Chinese, Israelis, on and on, Korean. We really, in space for a while, we really had bridged the cultures. And I remember thinking, how incredible. I grew up in the Cold War, and now all of a sudden we're in space together, not competing. And isn't that a great sign? Then all of a sudden the bottom fell out, it feels like. Right. And
and now you have Russia, where we thought we were coming together. Exactly right. and it was so hopeful. The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed, and it looked like Russia would convert into a democracy, and instead became a thugocracy. And now Putin has turned it into an ethnic nationalist kleptocracy, basically. And because he's an ethnic nationalist, he actually appeals to the ethnic nationalists who support Trump, so that many of them, the most extreme ones anyway, feel more loyalty in a way, or more solidarity with Russia than they do with the United States, because they share that ethnic nationalist outlook, and they are united against globalism. Globalism is a very much Enlightenment tendency, and they hate globalism. They hate the United Nations because of this. That's the sort of rational world order kind of thing that's peaceful and makes all kinds of sense, but they see as a threat to their ethnic identity and as soulless. So strangely, now we live in a world where there are Americans who actually genuinely feel more sympathetic to Vladimir Putin than they do to the United States.
And I hear they're trying to propel a new kind of electricity by getting wind power from Ronald Reagan spinning in his grave as this is going on.
Exactly. It's very bizarre.
All right, let us take one more break here. Dan, thanks for all your help. Spencer Critchley, you're listening to Talk of the Bay. I'm Brad Cover. The guest is Spencer Critchley, who wrote the book, what's the name, Spencer? Patriots of Two Nations.
Two Nations.
Yes, and is bringing in a talk here at the end of the month free that we've had for the last 4 years, trying to unite Republicans and Democrats and have them talk logically and sincerely. It's called How to Save Democracy or Saving Democracy, and we'll talk about that more too. But first, let us get some important messages about KSQD and other things.
All right, Brad, thank you very much. And when we come back, we have a caller. But first, these messages.
Despite what you've seen on the internet, a giant squid cannot read your mind. And that's why KSQD is asking our listeners to take part in our first listener survey. We want to know how you feel about KSQD. What do you like? What don't you like? What's missing? As an added incentive, 5 lucky survey takers will be selected at random to receive a KSQD shirt just for participating. Let us know how we can better serve you by having your voice heard. It's quick and easy to do. Go to our website, ksqd.org, and click on the Listener Survey. Thanks for helping KSQD, KSQD Santa Cruz.
And yes, we'd love for you to fill out that survey. And we'd also like to let you know that if you've never had a library card, now is the perfect time to get one. Santa Cruz Public Library System has worked with vendors to enable our community to gain instant access to their digital collections of ebooks, audiobooks, movies, music, and more by getting a library card entirely online. If you have a library card but don't know how to download ebooks and other content available online, the library has staff ready to help you by phone, email, or text. Get help, you can call 831-427-7713 or send a text to 831-264-0647. Or you can visit the library website, santacruzpl.org. Okay, well, we've got a caller, and I believe he's on the air now.
Hello, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Hi, Brad. It's Rev Rebelly.
Oh, one of my favorite people on this earth.
I heard you gave me a heads up about Spencer's appearing on your show, and I think it's been wonderful. I've really enjoyed hearing him and listening to the story of his book and why he wrote it and what the thesis is. And the main reason I called was not only to give him a shout out for doing the book and for trying to get the two sides together, which I think makes an awful lot of sense and something we need to do. I thought it would be interesting to quote what Fareed Zakaria said in his column in the Washington Post the other day, and he felt that the divide between the Trumpers and the non-Trumpers has to do with the different education levels of the people who are anti-Trump and the people who are pro-Trump. Those who are anti-Trump tend to be college graduates, And the interesting thing is that only 36% of Americans are college graduates, and another 17% have advanced degrees, which means that there's barely a half of our population who do have advanced education. And if you tie in those who have advanced education with the Enlightenment and with reason and with the rule of law and with those things which our country stands for and the Constitution is written about, and the 10. I want to say that I don't want to say the 10 Commandments, but the Bill of Rights is what I want to say. If you tie that into education, I think maybe that helps to explain the divide.
Yes.
The elitists, those who have an education, are those who can work from home and whom the coronavirus has not affected too terribly. Whereas those who've got to get out there and work with their hands for a living, the grocery clerks and the agricultural workers and the transportation workers, and they're at greatest risk of getting coronavirus. And they're the ones who've been left, in many cases, left behind by the technical revolution, the movement to computers and the movement to doing so much of our manufacturing overseas in China and other places. And it seems to me that those things are part of the reason for the great divide of the Trumpers versus the non-Trumpers. I agree that we need to speak in terms of symbols and emotions and intuition. I think that makes a lot of sense in order to communicate, but and that's probably the answer to it, to tie art and spirituality and music and drama into your talk as someone who is a proponent of the Enlightenment and of reason and that sort of thing, and as you are a college graduate. But forget that and talk in terms of emotions. But anyway, I just thought I'd add that in.
Well,
Spencer, what do you say?
And I agree. I actually saw that episode of Fareed Zakaria GPS, which is an excellent show, Sunday mornings on CNN, if anybody's hungry for smart, rational discussion that includes people from the left and right. That's a terrific example of it. And I agree with what you just said, Red. And actually, I have a chapter in my book called Meritocracy and Corruption, How Wrong Can Look Right, that addresses that. The meritocracy that we've all inherited since about the 50s or so, again, many of us on the Enlightenment side, especially if we're doing okay in life, tend to see meritocracy as a self-evident democratic good. I mean, why would you not want to promote people based on their knowledge and skills and their merit, as opposed to the old days when it was heredity and connections? So it seems self-evidently good. But it actually only looks self-evidently good if you're one of the winners under meritocracy, because, as I make the point in the book, if you think about how it works, that you end up as a smart person who's capable of learning and, learning the skills that are necessary to succeed in this knowledge-driven economy, that's very similar to happening to be born into an aristocratic family, because nobody chooses their IQ level. Nobody chooses the parents. Nobody chooses to be born into a well-off, stable neighborhood that has good schools and is not plagued by crime. And, let's just imagine, if there's a median income level, that means by definition, median intelligence level. Let's just look at raw genetic intelligence. That means half the country is going to be born at or below that level through no fault of their own. And set aside the inequities of the school system and the advantages of having parents, who are well-educated themselves and who can pay for tutors, etc. You might just actually be born not very smart. And that means you're out of luck. and then maybe you are smart, but again, all kinds of disadvantages because your parents weren't literate or you're in a poor neighborhood, bad schools, whatever. So the meritocracy actually sets up a great deal of unfairness, and many people who feel excluded from it are understandably resentful. And so that's part of it. And we can be blind to this, as I say, if we're among the meritocracy's winners. And unfortunately, people on our side of this gulf make it much worse. Any time we talk about people being stupid on the other side or express contempt for them, like what kind of idiot would vote for Donald Trump, for example. And he says a lot of stuff that is ridiculous or hateful.
No, really?
But it just widens the gap. And the more actually people mock Trump for being stupid or clownish or not knowing anything, actually, the more it reinforces that sense of division. And you're right, I think a lot of it is driven by the meritocracy.
That's an excellent point. You're quite right. You're quite right. Meritocracy can be dependent upon your genes, your parents, your upbringing. You're quite right. I see that very, very clearly. And I can see how those who don't have those particular advantages can take umbrage and feel resentful, as you put it. No, that's
corruption starts to make sense. Corruption starts to make sense. You can say, well, this system is designed to keep people like me down. I'll never succeed in this system, so of course I want somebody corrupt on my side.
Right. Well, how then do you talk to someone with those feelings that you just expressed in a way that is sympathetic and understanding, and in a way that uses symbols and emotions and intuition? How do you do that with someone who feels, look, I just have bad genes. It's not my fault. Give me a break.
Well, and it's going to be hard to find somebody who would put it that way, but what you'll hear is a lot of people saying, look, finally Trump is somebody who will fight for people like me, or he'll fight for the real America, for example, right? Yeah. And you can argue, so if you argue back and say, what do you mean by the real America? Do you mean white America? Then it's over before it even gets started. So
that's not the right way to talk.
It's more important to establish a connection of trust first before trying to prosecute an argument, and that involves values, and it involves, it's like in normal, we tend to forget this the more we get into our heads, that, the more intellectual we become, the more we lose track of the basics. But if you think about meeting somebody back in the day when we could still shake hands, a handshake makes no sense at all. There's no information in a handshake, but the point of it is physical contact.
Yes.
To establish a sense of closeness and a sense of trust. And so it's more about, don't argue. Let's say you're arguing abortion with somebody who's very much against abortion rights. Don't argue the law or the constitutional issues, or women's equality. Why not start off with, you probably both care deeply about the lives of children.
Right.
So start there and find some common values so that the other person can see you're not some kind of baby murderer. And try to establish the relationship and the trust first, and the argument can wait.
Spencer, so what's your argument when they say windmills cause cancer? What's your argument
so again, if you come back with that's ridiculous,
that just
that's
makes
not
it
going to go anywhere.
Absolutely. You've got to try and understand and accept and listen to the other person, and really listen. I mean, not kid around, just really listen and try to take it. And you're quite right. The argument about abortion, aren't we all interested in the health of children? Aren't we all interested in having kids who are well brought up and have good parents and good understanding and helpful and that sort of thing? That's a very good point.
So
I'm going to read the book,
values,
no question about it.
Most people share similar values, even if they seem to express them in radically different ways. But, nobody wants to destroy the earth. Nobody wants to kill children.
No, of course not. What's your background, Spencer? What's your educational background and all?
Well, it's pretty varied. I actually started off as a professional musician and songwriter, and that led me to, that was sort of what I did till I was around 30 or so, and it led me to
you weren't a philosophy major? You weren't a history major in school?
I was an English major, and I minored in music.
Okay.
I thought for a while I was going to become an English professor, but I ended up becoming a professional musician. And then I ended up writing music for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation through that, and writing music for a bunch of other clients. I was signed with Warner Chappell Music along with my brother. We were a songwriting duo. And
oh, my goodness.
We wrote music for ourselves, but also for hire for other people. And then through writing music for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, I learned journalism, and one thing led to another, and I spent some time as a journalist, and then I became very interested in the modern networked world that was emerging back in the 90s, and I ended up in Silicon Valley working at a series of high-tech startups in sort of the history of multimedia and the Internet. And then eventually got into politics, kind of stumbled into that as well, and worked on a bunch of political campaigns, including both of the Obama campaigns. And now I have a communications consulting firm that sort of pulls it all together.
That's a wonderful background, amazing background, amazing.
It's kind of a mix of the Enlightenment and the Counter-Enlightenment when you look at it, really.
Yeah,
because the music was totally Counter-Enlightenment.
So good for you, Brad, for getting such a fascinating and interesting guest on your show. I think that's terrific. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Reb. Thanks for calling. Anytime.
You're very welcome. Keep it up.
Right.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Sure.
So we've got to do some business right here. We're running a little late. Dan's going to want me to do some messages, and then we'll be back for about another 10 minutes with you, Spencer. Dan, Are we ready? Take it away.
Got an old car taking up space in your garage or driveway? Why not put a squid behind the wheel? Donate your used car to KSQD through the Car Easy Donation Program. They even make the arrangements to have it towed. You get a tax deduction, and KSQD gets a monetary contribution. For more information, go to the donate page of our website, ksqd.org. Thanks.
And you're listening to Talk of the Bay here on KSQD Santa Cruz. It's 5:49, and coming up at 6 is Climate One. Tonight from 6 to 7 p.m., Climate One, produced by the Commonwealth Club, is a forum for candid discussion among climate scientists, policymakers, activists, and concerned citizens, with a focus on energy, the economy, and the environment. Climate One airs tonight in just a few minutes from 6 to 7 p.m. and also every Tuesday morning, tomorrow morning at 7 a.m., right here on KSQD 90.7 FM and online at ksqd.org. And then after Climate One, we have Monday Night at the Opera from 7 till 10 tonight, and then Sounds of Brazil from 10 till midnight. And now back to Talk of the Bay with
me, Brad Kava. Am I here? Am I on? Are we on? Yes, we're on. And Spencer Critchley, author, musician, broadcaster, journalist, techie. You are the Renaissance man.
Well, either that or I just have a short attention span.
And we got to talk to Roland Rebley. Do you know him? Do you know of him?
I don't think so. What a great guy. I really enjoyed talking with him.
Oh, he is so amazing. I'd like him to co-host this show with me. He's been a guest sometime, but he donates. He's a philanthropist, and anything that needs saving, he's out there to save. He's a great man.
Oh, that's
the
great.
Funny thing is, I met him a decade ago, and I was terrified to meet him because he had contributed to John McCain. I saw that. He was a Republican.
Oh.
He was so he is a great example of how you can recover, because he's no longer a Republican, but he was for a few minutes or for a bit or maybe most of his life until then. But he, what do you say, compassionate conservative? That's what he was. He's a guy who goes down, does the census, goes down to the homeless camps, walks down the hills and the ravines, and talks to people at 6 a.m. to try to help them.
Wow.
And I should say he's almost 90 years old, but he's more sprightly and fit than I am, I think. And he really just gets out there.
One of the good things about this terrible time we're living through, I've found, is making friends with people like that who have been Republicans most of their lives, and to discover the deep common shared values that we have. The people that we're having for Saving Democracy on May 26th for the Facebook Live event are examples of that. Mike Madrid, the guy from the Lincoln Project, who did the Morning in America ad that I mentioned at the top, the one that's been driving President Trump crazy. Lifelong Republican, one of the leading Republican consultants, cannot vote for Trump, cannot support him. Dan Schnur, he's now declined a state voter, describes himself, as I said, as a raging moderate, but worked for the John McCain campaign in his campaigns in a senior position, including the presidential campaign of McCain, I believe, and worked for Pete Wilson and other leading Republicans. And Kristen Olson, a leader of the California Republican Party. These are all people who are conservatives because of sincere belief. You can disagree with them on policies, but they're not bad people. They're good people. They have deep principles, and that's inspiring. And that's what democracy is about. We make a huge mistake if we think, if people are liberals like I am, to just assume that anybody on the other side must be just, greedy or whatever the caricatures are. There are a lot of people of very good faith who you can disagree with, but you find that you agree on fundamental principles like democracy, the tolerance, compassion, inclusivity, the rule of law. They just have a different way of getting there.
Well, I look at, say, Christianity, which is a great teaching and a great philosophy, and yet I find these people who think you should lock kids up in cages from another country. I'm not sure that that's the same book that I read.
No,
that they're seeing Jesus in the same way I saw him.
I think part of the Enlightenment legacy that those of us who are in the Enlightenment tradition tend to let reason constrain us too much sometimes, I think. And so Democrats, for example, are famously uncomfortable. Many Democrats, certainly not all of them. I mean, the black democratic tradition is very much rooted in the black church, for example. But a lot of Democrats are very uncomfortable talking about religion because it doesn't fit into that reason-driven view of the world.
Mm-hmm.
I think we should get over that, whether we're religious or not. Recognize that it represents deep longings that people have for deeper meaning. That doesn't. The fact that it doesn't actually make rational sense is part of the point. And to recognize that somebody like Jesus was a great teacher, and to engage with people on that level, and not to insult them as Bible thumpers or fundamentalist wackos and stuff, but to try to engage again on those shared values and try to be able to do a little reading. If you're not really that familiar with that tradition or other religious traditions, do a little reading, learn a little more about it, and talk to people about what Jesus said about the least of these and the stranger, welcoming the stranger, which is very relevant to what's going on at the border right now, for example. Jesus would be at the border, and I've had this discussion with devout fundamentalist Christians on TV. Jesus would be at the border, trying to save those children and those families. And in fact, Jesus is those children.
Yes.
Brad, we have in just the last 2 minutes, we've got another caller.
Let's take it. Hi, welcome to the show. Welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Hi, Brad. It's your poor beleaguered partner, Suki, here calling in.
Oh, Suki. Hey.
I just wanted to find out, I guess I feel like I completely agree with everything that you're saying, but having just had an interaction with someone who on Facebook who I know in real life also, who has no interest in changing her view. She's very smart. Do you really think that we can engage people? I feel like every time I try, it's just futile.
Yeah. There's going to be some people who are not reachable. And there are some people who are not, I'm not saying this is true of your friend, but there are some people who do not have good intentions. They like Trump because they are racist, or they are totally out to just loot the country, and that's why they like him. But a lot of people actually do mean well, but they're kind of lost in this tribal division and this hatred and fear. And from their point of view, they've been taught through their media for decades now that liberals hate America and are trying to destroy everything that's good about America. And so they're genuinely afraid, and from fear comes hatred. And it's going to take a long time, and it won't be done through trying to persuade them to change their opinions. It'll be done, I believe, through showing that you're actually a good human being with a good heart. And
hey guys, I gotta cut it.
From there.
What do you?
Suki, you know this well.
We're media, though.
We're at the deadline. Suki, show over. We gotta.
Okay.
I promised Dan I'd end it at 57. But Suki, that's great to have you on with us too. Dan, is this it? We're done. Dan is he's the voice of reason here. Yes, I guess we're done. Thank you all for listening. Spencer, thanks for being here. I'm going to buy your book. I'm going to buy Reb a copy of your book too.
Well,
and
I hope people will.
maybe
Thanks,
Suki
Brad.
too. Yeah. All right. Thanks again. And we'll be back next week and every week.